Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Jamin Dick. Jamin's career spans a number of senior leadership roles across companies such as Target, Pitney Bowes, Alibaba, and most recently as Chief Supply Chain Officer of Land's End. Thank you so much for joining
Happy to
me.
be here.
A good starting point, I'd love to just get to know a little bit more about your career journey so far. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Certainly. As you mentioned, I started my career with IBM, and I was kind of new to the world of retail, but I ended up doing a lot of consulting with IBM at retail clients, and I found that I really liked that. I liked the retail world, and I eventually made the jump from consulting into that of a business owner at Target. So I jumped over to Target and spent quite a long time at Target, helping develop the Target private label business, as well as Target.com, and really an extraordinary experience. Target's a great culture and a great brand, and something I'm very proud of being part of. I spent a few years in Hong Kong with one of Target's largest apparel suppliers, called SML Group. And then I also did a couple of startups in New York City, Open Sky and Border Free, which Border Free is a cross-border platform that you may know about. And then spent a little bit of time with Alibaba, about 4 years with Alibaba, and just an incredible company, which we can talk more about later, but really incredible company with so many different business lines that have really dominated in their area. And then most recently, as you mentioned, I was a chief supply chain officer for Land's End, where I oversaw the sourcing world and procurement, and as well as just logistics and transportation. But in parallel, I've been doing independent work under the JDIC Advisory banner, and that's what I focus on today, where I help retailers and brands figure out how to go faster and shorten their supply chain. So that's a little bit of a background for me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I guess as a starting point, could you tell me a little bit about earlier on in your career, what was some advice that was given to you from mentors, some advice that sort of stuck with you that then has helped to form where you are today in your career?
Well, yeah. So mentors have been very important to me, and really helped me figure out how to operate in large companies and figure out how to provide value. I remember one in particular at IBM, and he just really helped me understand the importance of understanding the essentials of the business that you're in, and just going back and doing that homework, right? You don't skip that stuff. You have to kind of internalize the dynamics of how do we make money? How do we satisfy our customers? How do we build a product? How do we get that product from point A to point B? So really, don't skip that. It was sort of learn the essentials and the fundamentals of whatever your business is, to the point where you could pass a quiz on it at any point. And that was really valuable to me, because before I could even consider adding value to any company, I realized I had to kind of internalize how they operate first, and really know it well. So that was an important moment for me. I think the other thing I took from my mentors early in my career was just continuously studying what's happening, what's emerging in the industry that we're working in. Am I conversant in that? Am I understanding how it affects my business? So really, the essentials of the business, plus then kind of keeping an eye on the future, were really important in my journey.
One thing I'd like to touch on that I think you've got quite unique experience within, having worked both, in quite domestic environments such as Target, but then also incredibly international companies such as Alibaba. How do you feel your experience, both sort of in the US and then moving to Hong Kong, has helped to then move into a chief supply chain officer role in the future? And how do you credit those sort of international opportunities in developing you into that stage of your career?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because my journey is was very intentional in some ways, in other ways opportunistic. But I think like all of us, we take opportunities as they come. But there was some intentionality here because I knew it was important for me to not get comfortable in just doing kind of the same thing over and over. And so I kind of was hungering for something that challenged me. And I remember going from Target to a company in Hong Kong, where at Target, I knew the ropes. I knew exactly how to kind of be successful at Target. And it wasn't easy, but there was a path, a career path. Then I found myself in Hong Kong, a totally different type of company, different culture, and everything was sort of out the window. And I had to relearn how to navigate the company and how to be successful. And I felt like the first few months I was wearing kryptonite, or I was just like, I can't, nothing's working, and it was hard because there's a language barrier and things like that where in the dynamics of the business are different. There's not as much of a safety net. Like at Target, if you make a mistake, you can recover from that. Smaller companies, you have to limit the amount of big mistakes that you can make, and it's important to recognize that. So I remember being in that environment and realizing, okay, I need to sort of go back to basics here and figure out like what's going to be successful in this role. The other thing I would say going to Alibaba is living overseas and working in a Chinese business or Vietnamese business or whatever is you're looking through the supply chain from a different lens than you would from the US. And it really opens your eyes. It really changes kind of how you see suppliers and how you see getting product around. There's no substitute for seeing it happen. Getting in the factory, seeing how things move from factory to ship to port, port to ship and beyond. So I really encourage people, if you have that opportunity, you should take it because a little bit of international will really help kind of broaden your perspective. It just you there's no way to really describe what specifically changes, but somehow you just see things a little bit differently when you do that. So I would encourage that, especially for supply chain oriented career professionals. I think that's really essential.
No, brilliant. I think particularly when it comes to Asia, particularly when an organization is sourcing so heavily from Asia, time on the ground, as you say, going to plants, going and seeing how that is done and what that journey looks like. You can read about it, you can speak with people that do it, but there's no real alternative to that. I guess a question on what you mentioned around when you were in Hong Kong. You mentioned obviously the first few months being quite challenging, but then finding your way into working in that new environment. Was there anything that you found particularly helped to push that process along of integrating into a different culture and working within a different culture there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing is don't. I guess if I was giving advice to people who are going to try something similar, I would say be careful of going to live in an environment where it's too much of an expat bubble, right? So we ended up living in a pretty local Hong Kong neighborhood, and which meant we had to learn how to get around in a taxi in Cantonese and order food in Cantonese, and I would say that's part of it. And then the other part was, getting to know my team by going to dim sum with them on a regular basis and just sort of seeing how they live their lives was important because it also developed trust the other direction. They wanted to see that I was invested in their success as well. And so that was a big thing. Just kind of jump into the culture, um, get to know get to know the customs and the food and just those kind of basics. Um, Whereas if we had lived in there are parts of Hong Kong which are very, very much a bubble, and I think it would have been made it harder, actually, easier in some ways, but also harder to actually be successful with my team, which I really needed that to happen. So that was probably the biggest thing.
For sure. And I think, I'm curious whether you feel that role then with Alibaba would have been not manageable. I'm sure you would have been able to manage it, but obviously how much easier you found that
Yeah.
having actually spent time on the ground in Hong Kong and worked in international environments rather than just in domestic environments within the United States.
Absolutely. And you have to like this kind of stuff a little bit. You have to kind of like that. Yeah, I'm jet lagged. I can't understand what's happening around me always. You have to have a comfort level with that kind of thing, or it really will get to you after a while. But and I do like that. I like the challenge. I like the kind of the. It's just different than what you get at home. But it did make things better and make things a little bit more comfortable working at Alibaba. Now, I will say Hong Kong and Hangzhou are not at all the same. They're very different from each other, and the culture of Alibaba is very different from other company cultures. But you have to kind of like surfing from different cultures, different company cultures, and hearing anything but English a lot.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
No, brilliant. I think it's as you say, it's not necessarily having like for like cultures by any stretch, but being comfortable, being uncomfortable, and being okay with being out of your comfort zone and in an environment where it's not as familiar. Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant. If we look a little bit more forwards, supply chain is transforming very quickly as a function. Supply chain is changing very quickly overall. What would you say are some of the most important skills that future supply chain leaders should be focusing on developing today?
yeah. Well, I think there's two guardrails for a career in supply chain. One is making sure that you understand the fundamentals of any business really run on the same principles. So that's sort of the conservative side of the supply chain equation, right? No business is healthier by carrying more inventory, right? You need to make your customers happy. You need to make money. So you need to move as quickly as you can to develop products. So these are sort of fundamentals, and there are many more. So that's one guardrail is no matter what new trends are coming, you need to make sure they translate into kind of the core values that drive any business. Because those things aren't, I would say, are not going to change, right? Um, and then on the other side of the equation is keeping up with what is changing, and then being open to doing things a new way. And a good example on that is, of course, AI is super relevant right now, and figuring out how much of that is going to be relevant versus how much is just hype that's going to go away. It takes a little bit of thinking and research and guesswork. So I think about, you know, planning, AI network optimization. There's a lot of different things where I could imagine the new emerging technologies are going to really help us. Um, but it's easy to get distracted at the shiny things, and so I think it's always mapping it back to the first part of that, which is, but do they drive fundamental improvements in the way that we do business today? So I think having that discernment and that insight is sort of the critical piece there, figuring out how the new trends are driving kind of the principles of good business.
You mentioned that first guardrail, business and being able to translate supply chain needs into business needs will always be relevant. How did you personally go about learning those sort of business side of things and that translation piece? And what would you recommend to people to develop those skills themselves?
Well, there's probably no substitute for getting into a business, getting your feet wet, and just, that was my transition from consulting to being part of a retail business. And there's something about reading getting the daily reads, and how are our sales doing? How are our in stocks? What are our customers saying from customer care team? So that's how I do it. I kind of soak up the dailies, and just understand what's moving in the business. And what that does is it gives you a language to translate from supply chain problem to business need. And so prior to that, everything was sort of, well, what's cool to talk about? What's the latest cool thing to talk about? And when you're running a retail business, you don't that's not you don't have time for that. You have to retail is such a game of like, are we going to win today? Are we going to win tomorrow? How do we stay relevant over the long term? It's a hard game, right? Retail is not easy. And the best companies are the ones that they do improve, they do become better than everybody else, but they're reading their dailies, they're understanding what is changing, what's moving in their business, and they read and react quickly. So that's kind of the mentality I think that's successful, at least in the retail supply chain world. That's what it looks like to be successful. Um, it's not as much the kind of high-minded stuff. I'll just say it. It's very much about like, what are your customers saying today about your business, your customer, your products, your how fast you're delivering to them, and what can you do, now to make next year better for them?
No, brilliant. I think really, really good advice there. And in terms of changing trends and things we're seeing in the market at the moment, there is a lot to keep up with. I think you're right. There's a lot of noise around AI and all these other trends. There are a lot of different priorities to focus on. Learning those core business fundamentals and how to work with a C-suite, how to speak with the CEO, how to speak the language of business is
Yeah.
always going to be important. And on some of those changing trends, AI is something that is spoken about so much, but what about other sort of skill sets? We look at geopolitics, for example, and supply chain resiliency. Is there anywhere that you would advise people to develop their skills and learn more in that space?
Yeah, for sure. And clearly, given all the changes that are happening with the new administration, there's sort of a trade war 2.0 that's happening. Um, it would, but I want to be clear, every year there's something, right? So after years of doing this, there was the housing crisis and the kind of the financial collapse of the 2008 time period, and then of course COVID, and um, we went from $2,000 containers to $10,000, $12,000 containers overnight. And then there was port strikes and Suez conflict, and Panama Canal dried up for a minute there, and so like there's always something in supply chain. So anybody who's like, oh well, we're going to get back to normal. Well, there is no normal. Normal in supply chain is disruption, and unfortunately, and so I think the most successful people are going to be planning for that. They're going to be learning how to be agile, how to be resilient in their supply chain, build that into your supply chain and your business. So a really specific example of that would be, are you overly dependent on one production location? You should be thinking about that. Even if it's not China, maybe Vietnam, you're overly invested in. How do you start to build resilience for maybe there's another labor strike that could come up and disrupt your domestic supply chain? So I think the principle I'm talking about there is having a plan B, being resilient. It's extremely important to be thinking like that and to just not be like, today it looks good over here, so I'm just going to go all in on that. Um, so yeah, I think that's probably the most important thing right now.
No, brilliant. If we're circling back to career advice, what advice would you give to someone just starting out their career in supply chain?
Um, I think what I would say is uh, be a student of the best companies out there. Really, really get into. There's no secret to, like there's not a secret class that you go to learn how to be a good supply chain leader. It's looking at the best companies out there and seeing understanding what they're doing, and also the ones that aren't doing it well, right? I mean, I learn a lot from people who have made mistakes, and I try not to be one of them. So, and I think it's looking at the world around you. I long have admired companies like Inditex, Zara, right? They did something really important years back by rethinking their supply chain. And now there are all kinds of new models out there, and I think that's free. You can learn all about that. I would go to companies. I would just ask for warehouse tours. I went to Zappos one time. I never worked for Zappos, but I just was curious about how they did their fulfillment, and they said, "Sure, come on by." So I flew down and walked through there. You can do stuff like that. A lot of companies will do that. Some won't, but you can learn a lot just by asking. So I would just give people that little bit of advice that, get out there. You don't, you don't, you don't get what you don't ask for. So I think if you ask people for a tour, they might give it to you.
No, amazing. Really, really good advice, and something that, personally as a headhunter, I sometimes go to my clients and I say, hey, look, I recruited for X, Y, and Z, but I'd like to see how it actually works. I'd like to really understand what's going on here. And, I'm not a supply chain professional. I'm a recruiter, but going and seeing something and walking through and really contextualizing it can help so much in understanding, oh, right, this is actually how this works. This is actually what's happening. So, no, I think that's great advice. On the other side of the coin, what advice would you give to a senior leader who is maybe at VP, SVP level? They're aspiring to their first C-suite role. What advice would you give to that person to prepare them for that C-suite opportunity?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I'll go back to my Alibaba days. One thing that was really important to me, the average age of Alibaba employees was 29, I believe.
Wow.
And it's an enormous company. So, very young company. And I would say that for an up and coming executive, you should want to be comfortable in that environment where it's sort of a flatter organization. You may be responsible for a lot of people, but having an open door to ideas. I heard a great talk from Jeff Bezos recently, and he just talked about speaking last as the CEO in a meeting, and I think it makes sense because as a leader, it's easy to say, this is my opinion, like everybody should get on board with that. But then you miss out on sort of the wisdom of teams, the wisdom of maybe people have ideas that haven't been thought of. You won't hear those ideas if you don't make a culture that encourages that. So I think some of the things that I learned at Alibaba were hearing sort of the radical, unvarnished ideas of people that were just coming into the company, but they had really good ideas. Sometimes they weren't great ideas, but sometimes my ideas don't work out either. So I don't love hearing sort of this intergenerational sniping that happens a lot. Millennials towards Gen X and vice versa, or these Gen Zs don't understand how business works. Well, we need to start integrating across those. We need the Gen Zs to come into the workforce and learn from people who have made mistakes and not make those same mistakes. But also we need the kind of fresh thinking. We need people, they're going to replace me at some point. So I want to make sure that we have a great pipeline of younger people who are coming in. They're learning from me, but they're also helping shape our strategy with a more relevant perspective. So, I think that's probably the most important thing that could happen in business right now is just trying to incorporate cross-generational ideas into the business strategy.
Brilliant. No, look, thank you so much. I think there's some really, really good advice in there, and really appreciate you taking the time to join me today.
It's been my pleasure. Very nice to meet you and talk to you, Sam.
Thanks so much.